Welcome to Great in the Sack, when misogyny leads to mayhem. I'm your host, Nicole Davenport.
911, what's the emergency,
At approximately 6 a.m. on March 20th, 2025, emergency services in Tifton, Georgia, which, by the way, is nicknamed as, quote, the friendly city, end quote, which I honestly have a ton of questions about, to be honest. Anyway, they responded to a medical emergency at the Brookfield Mews apartment complex. A woman was found unconscious and suffering from severe blood loss due to a miscarriage she'd had earlier. A miscarriage is medically known as a spontaneous abortion, which, as we've talked about in the episode about Yoseli Barnica, is extremely problematic, not to mention dangerous AF. This, of course, is largely due to the almost vulgar association that right-wing conservatives have desperately tried to connect to the word abortion, even though the term abortion can mean different things. This is absolutely the kind of medical crisis where survival depends on swift and honestly compassionate care. Paramedics rushed Serena to the Tift Regional Medical Center, treating her like any person in need of urgent help. But within days, she was no longer being treated as a patient, but instead as a criminal. Her name is Selena Maria Chandler Scott, and for 1 week, she was forced to sit in the Tift County Sheriff's Office to await trial after suffering the devastating loss of a miscarriage. Jail. Let that sink in. A witness told authorities that she'd had a miscarriage and then placed the remains in a bag and later in a dumpster outside of the apartment complex. A detail that is a direct reflection of the fear-mongering instilled in citizens over abortions. Someone gave her up to police, for whatever reason, the most likely of which being that they feared for themselves, so they took any attention away from themselves by providing this information to authorities. Miscarrying in a country where pregnancy itself is now criminally scrutinized puts everybody at risk. She was arrested and charged with concealing the death of another person and abandonment of a dead body. You see, Georgia has this horrible law called the Life Act, aka the 6-week abortion ban, which, yes, sounds just like the Texas Heartbeat Act, aka Texas SB 8, aka the Texas 6-week abortion ban, the law that was responsible for the horrible death of Yoseli Barnica due to her miscarriage that doctors refused to medically intervene with. Fun fact, this Georgia law was passed in 2019, but was found to be, quote, unenforceable by a federal court in 2020. But Georgia Republicans, that grand old party, were all over it again, post Roe v. Wade, and so it was passed, again, in October 2024. But just when you thought it couldn't get much worse, so buckle up. In addition to this brutal way of treating women in need of the basic human right of reproductive care, this so-called act gives the fetus personhood. This feels like nightmare fuel to me. Using this legal technique puts any and every American woman who is pregnant at risk. Pregnancy is being used as a weapon against women. Instead of being given the support she needed, Selena was handcuffed. Instead of being treated with dignity, she was branded a fucking suspect. The audacity of putting a woman in jail after suffering a miscarriage, it's just bonkers. Autopsy results revealed that the fetus was 19 weeks old. There were no signs of trauma, and the fetus never took a breath. There has never been an instance on record, in fact, where a fetus of 19 weeks old has been able to survive on its own, the earliest of which is 21 weeks, and it's actually in the Guinness Book of World Records. I feel the need to ask the women listening, what would you have done in this situation? How would you have handled it? Like, what is the right way to handle something like this? Did they send out pamphlets when they reinstated this terrible law, or what? The Georgia judicial system is flexing its power because Trump is letting them. Now, while it seems clear that Serena has done nothing wrong in the eyes of the law, as far as what they call murder and what I call fucking absurd, seems as though they wished to make an example by keeping her so long. They treated her as though she did something truly malicious, as though she tried to cover up the death of an actual person. I can't even imagine the trauma that she has endured. More than 1,800 people faced criminal consequences between 1973 and 2022 for pregnancy-related issues, according to Pregnancy Justice, an organization that fights the criminalization of pregnant people. Well, you might be wondering, how did we get here? How did we get to a place where pregnancy loss, one of the most deeply personal and devastating experiences a person can have, is met with shackles instead of sympathy, where laws meant to protect life are being used to punish women? How did we get here? We got here because of women like Phyllis Schlafly. And I think to really understand, we need to go back. Back before Phyllis Schlafly, before Roe v. Wade, before the hideous, deceitful backlash of the conservative Republicans, before the Equal Rights Amendment was seen as a threat, back to something as small and seemingly insignificant as a word. 2 little letters, actually. Ms. As per the usual, show notes and sources can be found on Podbean and on Spotify. This podcast supports Selena Maria Chandler Scott and her family. While they are going through this incredibly difficult time, I have included the link to Selena's GoFundMe account, which is run by her family, so that they'll be better able to deal with the situation. Content warning: discussions of SA, violence against women, abortions and miscarriages, and religious abuse. Use caution where and how you listen. Did you know that the honorific Ms. was once considered radical? While the terms Ms. and Mrs., derived from Mr., didn't always indicate a person's marriage status, it began to exclusively do so around the 19th century. This opened the door for an alternative term, which became popular in the 20th century, the term Ms. The first known use of Ms. in print appeared in 1901 in the Springfield Republican, of all places, where an anonymous writer suggested it as a neutral alternative to Miss and Mrs., a way to address a woman without being reduced to her marital status. But it didn't catch on then, because in 1901, women weren't seen as independent enough to need a title separate from marriage. A woman was either a Miss, available and unclaimed, or a Mrs., spoken for and properly owned. There was no in-between, no autonomy, no neutrality. This was the era of the suffragists, and the suffragettes too. The suffragists being around a little longer, since mid-1800s. They were within the United States, working through peaceful means like petitions, legal challenges, and lobbying. These women were Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Ida B. Wells, to name a few. They were fighting for something bigger: political representation, the right to own property, the right to simply exist in the public sphere as full citizens. The suffragettes, on the other hand, were led by women like Emmeline Pankhurst in Britain, who said, "Enough waiting," and turned to more radical tactics, like hunger strikes, smashing windows, and even arson. They emerged in the early 1900s, mostly in Britain, as a more militant response to the slow progress of the suffragists. They used civil disobedience, protests, and sometimes even violence to demand the vote. Both groups paid dearly for doing this type of activism to win women the right to vote. When the women were sent to jail for civil disobedience or what have you, they would go on hunger strikes, to which the guards would abusively counteract by force-feeding these women. They did this by forcing feeding tubes down their throat or up their nose. The women said it was like torture. Yeah, it kind of sounds like waterboarding, right? And while Ms. was a mere footnote at the time, it was an early sign of what was to come. Women demanding language that reflected their growing independence. Suffrage was won in 1920 in the U.S. Partial voting rights in Britain were won in 1918 to full suffrage 10 years later. But the fight for true equality was just the beginning. For decades, women were still legally and socially expected to center their lives around men, fighting for their place in the workforce, for control over their own bodies, for protections against discrimination. And then, fast forward to the 1960s and 70s, where Ms. made its return, this time with a vengeance. Women's rights activists embraced it, seeing it as a rejection of the idea that a woman's identity should be tied to a man. Ms. magazine was launched by Gloria Steinem and Sheila Michaels in 1972, and suddenly this tiny word became like a battle cry, a symbol of autonomy, a challenge to the status quo. And one woman hated that more than anyone else, and that was Phyllis Schlafly. Ever the drama queen, upon being called Ms. at one point, Phyllis replied, "Don't call me Ms. It means misery to me." Schlafly understood that words and symbols mattered, and Ms., that tiny, unassuming title, was a direct threat to everything she stood for, because it represented women as independent beings. And that was something she simply could not allow, at least apparently not for other women. Because then, how could she start her own little grift movement as the mother of anti-feminism, complete with its cult of personality that was full of housewives? Phyllis Schlafly wasn't content with just following the path set for women of her time. She was ambitious, driven, and by all accounts brilliant, but she had that riz, that charisma. She 100% suffered from main character syndrome, a regular old grandiose narcissist. Oh, you guys will see when we touch again on her narcissistic characteristics. Yeah, Phyllis had an incessant need to be admired by others. Can't really fault her for that one, can we? The answer is yes, but we'll do that later. This is the part where you'd think, here's a woman who defied expectations, embraced the opportunities feminism was fighting for, and might use her voice to open doors for other women. But instead, she spent the rest of her life slamming those doors shut and bolting them, then lecturing women about how they should enjoy the cage. As a young woman, Phyllis was the embodiment of pick-me energy long before social media had a term for it. Oh, she absolutely rejected feminism. In fact, she would build an entire career on telling women they don't need careers. She insisted that a woman's place was in the home, even as she herself ran for Congress, wrote well over 20 books, and built a national campaign empire. The girl boss of conservative anti-girl bossing, if you will. Guys, I'm telling you, Phyllis Schlafly and Serena Waterford from The Handmaid's Tale are cut from the same cloth. Women who preach female subservience while making themselves exceptions to the rule. We will see similarities between how both women built their influence by enforcing a system that actively oppressed women, all while enjoying the personal power and autonomy that their own ideology denied other women. Serena's toxic trait, however, was that she thought she could be a ruler in a kingdom designed to erase her. Schlafly understood the grifting game better. She didn't fight to be on top. She fought to be indispensable. And that's why, unlike Serena, she never really lost. Phyllis Schlafly is hugely responsible for creating one of the first conservative grassroots movements in the United States of its kind. Her ability to blend religion and morale with politics is the reason for the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and for the very unfortunate rise of the illogical alt-right. Now, Phyllis Schlafly's early life is pretty contradictory. Born Phyllis McAlpin Stewart in St. Louis, Missouri, on August 15, 1924. Silent generation. She grew up in the dark shadow of the Great Depression. Her father, an industrial engineer, lost his job when she was a child, leaving the family in financial instability. But Phyllis's mother, a driven, college-educated woman, picked up the slack, working as a librarian and primary breadwinner. That's just wild. A woman who would later tell American housewives that financial independence was unnecessary, was herself raised by a working mother who had kept the family afloat. Schlafly's adolescence and early adulthood were marked by struggle, perfectionism, and an obsession with proving herself. Not to other women, but seemingly to men. But hey, I get it. When you're younger, that can be how it goes when raised in a religious home. Phyllis seemed extremely ashamed of her upbringing and tried desperately to bury the information down in the depths of her soul. She pursued higher education, but Phyllis wasn't there to challenge male dominance within the university. She was there to be accepted by it, to be one of the good ones, the exception to the rule she will spend decades reinforcing. She put herself through college, first at Maryville College in Missouri for a year. Then she transferred to Washington University, studying political science and working night shifts testing ammunition in 1944. A year later, she earned a master's in government from Radcliffe College, Harvard's women's college. Working at the ammunitions factory during World War II allowed her to later spin her patriotic, anti-communist persona. She also became well involved in conservative politics, latching on fully to McCarthyism and Cold War fear-mongering, gain political traction. On October 20th, 1949, Phyllis married attorney John Fred Schlafly Jr., who came from a very, very rich family from St. Louis, which was a stark contrast from that of herself and where she came from. Despite advocating for traditional housewives, she continued working and traveling, while Fred's money kept things running at home. Not to mention she had at least one housekeeper. Nothing like the average housewife, right? Phyllis became primarily recognized for her work on national defense and conservative politics. Elected to serve as an alternate delegate to the 1960 Republican National Convention from Illinois' 24th Congressional District, Schlafly used the convention to help lead a revolt of, quote, moral conservatives, end quote, who opposed Richard Nixon's stance against segregation and discrimination. Opposed, did you hear me? By 1964, she had solidified her role as a far-right ideologue. She gained national attention with her book, A Choice, Not an Echo, an unhinged attack on the so-called elites controlling the Republican Party. It was chocked full of different conspiracy theories and attacked the so-called Rockefeller Republicans while promoting Barry Goldwater. She would author over 20 books, almost all of them self-published, so no facts needed. In the 1970s, there was a shift inside Phyllis, from Cold War propagandist to anti-feminist crusader. Schlafly's most notorious grift began in the 1970s, when she pivoted all of her attention to the Equal Rights Amendment. Initially uninterested, Schlafly seems to have seen an opportunity to position herself at the helm of the next conservative outrage movement. This was a time of rapid social change. The Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, first proposed in 1923 and gaining steam in the 1970s, was supported by Democrats and Republicans alike. At first, it should have been a natural progression of women's rights. Instead, it became the battlefield where Phyllis Schlafly turned the tide against progress and reshaped American conservatism into the anti-feminist, anti-abortion piece of work that we got today. 1972 was an important year to the second wave of the feminist movement. After nearly 50 years of fighting, the Equal Rights Amendment had finally passed through Congress, the House, the Senate. Victory echoed through the chambers like a promise that was so long overdue. Now it was up to the states. 38 needed to ratify. Within months, 30 had already said yes. This was a thunderous, long overdue acknowledgement that equality on paper should apply to all genders. For the first time in American history, full personhood of a woman had a chance of being recognized by the Constitution. It passed through Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support. The amendment is simple. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Feminists had never been more united. Though their views weren't all the same, they came together to fight for women's rights, for legal equality. There were 5 women in particular who stood out during this time due to their activism and their fierce devotion to getting the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, fully ratified. Gloria Steinem was on the ground organizing, writing, speaking about equality, about liberation. The right to live and love without fear, shame, or permission. The housewife turned firebrand, Betty Friedan, was relentless. She had already begun to pull back the curtain in her book, The Feminine Mystique, exposing the emptiness behind the happy homemaker fantasy. Now she was mobilizing women by the thousands through National Organization for Women. Bold in her wide-brimmed hats, Bella Abzug, nicknamed Battling Bella, was unapologetic about politics. She had taken the fight to Congress, claiming, quote, "This woman's place is in the House of Representatives," end quote. And so it was, because she won. She also sponsored the Equality Credit Opportunity Act, the ECOA, which stops discrimination for credit line applications. Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress, stood on the House floor demanding the ERA's passage not just for women, but for everyone left behind in America's promises. "I am not the candidate of Black America," she said. "I am the candidate of the people." And then there's Brenda Feigen, Harvard-trained, known for her calm demeanor in the courtroom and devastatingly clear in debates. she co-founded the ACLU's Women's Rights Project with good old Ruth Bader Ginsburg and wielded the Constitution like a damn sword. She believed that equality was entirely achievable. For that moment in time, everything felt inevitable. Equality was coming. The ERA passed Congress. The states were lining up to ratify. The future was bright and feminist. And then, Schlafly has entered the chat. In 1972, she founded the Eagle Forum, a conservative political interest group, which she oversaw until her death in 2016. From this forum, she would begin a grassroots conservative campaign by sending out the Schlafly Report every month, in which she painted the libs as evil, godless creatures, of course. Following the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, by Congress, Phyllis Schlafly initiated a campaign to prevent its ratification by the states. She founded the Stop ERA organization, complete with the little stop sign on the logo, and the word stop was actually a backronym. It stood for, you'll never guess, Stop Taking Our Privileges, ERA. Phyllis, the lawyer, the activist, and the self-proclaimed defender of the American housewife, didn't see the ERA as a path to equality, but as an existential threat to the nuclear family. Or at least that became her shtick. While feminists fought for legal protections against gender discrimination, Schlafly weaponized the fear of quite literally God in housewives. Her main argument of her Stop ERA campaign was that the ERA would erase the privileges of women, forcing them into the military draft, stripping them of spousal support, and even leading to the horror of gender-neutral bathrooms. While the ERA was being chewed over in state legislatures, the Stop ERA campaign was coming in bloom, courtesy of dear Phyllis. The women who had given everything to this fight, Gloria Steinem, Shirley Chisholm, Bella Abzug, Betty Friedan, and Brenda Feigen, began organizing, educating, debating. This was their moment, or at least it should have been. The very same year that the Supreme Court handed down Roe v. Wade, recognizing for the first time in U.S. history that a woman had a constitutional right to control her own body, a huge counterattack was already being prepared. In 1973, on a televised debate with Schlafly, Betty Friedan seemed to have had enough. After being polite, after trying to play by the rules, after explaining again and again that equality wasn't about destroying femininity, but about freedom, she finally snapped. "I'd like to burn you at the stake," she said. And boom, there goes the dynamite. The feminist icon had just given Phyllis exactly what she wanted. The optics of a hysterical, aggressive woman ready to torch her enemies. Schlafly, ever the media manipulator, was calm and smug, playing the victim to perfection, while framing feminists as angry, man-hating radicals, women too ugly or too manly to find a husband even. Because what mattered was who came off as the most ladylike in front of the cameras. And in the court of public opinion, calm wins, even when it's dishonest. Meanwhile, on the legal battlefield, Roe v. Wade had landed like an earthquake. On January 22, 1973, U.S. Supreme Court ruled 7-2, favoring Jane Roe, that the constitutional right to privacy extended to a woman's decision to have an abortion. It was a moment of triumph, especially for feminists who understood how forced pregnancy was both a medical and a political form of control. For so many, it was vindication. For others, however, It was a declaration of war. Phyllis wasted no time. Later in life, she would be quoted as saying, quote, "Abortion is the right or the wrong issue of our time," end quote. She folded abortion right into her crusade against the ERA, warning that the amendment would enshrine abortion rights and destroy the American family. That all of this feminism was going to force children to become wards of the state. Now, never mind that the ERA had nothing to do with abortion. She knew how to fuse religious fear with political power. And that's exactly what she did. Perhaps her most insidious tactic was the argument that it would legalize same-sex marriage, a fear-mongering strategy that successfully mobilized religious conservatives long before marriage equality even became a national issue. Schlafly was mobilizing conservative women under the banner of preserving family values. In 1975, the United Nations declared it the International Women's Year, the IWY, prompting the U.S. to establish a commission to address women's issues nationally. This led to a series of state meetings across the country to gather input and elect delegates for the upcoming National Women's Conference in Houston, 1977. The first and only federally funded women's conference in U.S. history, the National Women's Conference. To the feminists who had fought hard for the ERA, for Roe, for a place in the damn room, this was their moment. A high-stakes gathering of over 2,000 delegates from every state and territory, charged with creating a national plan of action for women's equality. There would be state meetings intended to be platforms for unity and progress. However, they quickly became arenas of intense debate and at times outright confrontation. First, the conservative women under the tight-running BS ship SS Schlafly weren't taken seriously by the IWI Commission. They argued that they didn't need any type of compensation for the work they did at home. No, that the love their husbands showed was enough payment, of course. Tell me, is it even possible to make yourself any smaller than that? Many women in the audience laughed at this outrageous claim that love is enough payment for all of the work women do that is not seen as valuable, but simultaneously fluffed up to be one of the most important jobs there are. The presence of the housewives that Schlafly had pushed out to these early meetings for the convention were cartoon-like. Gloria Steinem, who I mentioned earlier, had said that she didn't even want to give Schlafly the time of day because it would give her extremism a platform. But Phyllis was not about to let what she would probably refer to as a feminist lesbian fest go unchallenged in Houston. But first, let's rewind a bit. Leading up to Houston, regional IWI conferences, now remember that's International Women's Year that the United Nations had put forth, which inspired the United States to put together the National Women's Conference in order to create a national plan of action for women's equality. Just reviewing because I know some of this stuff kind of just sounds like the same stuff, but it's important that we understand where we came from with all this and where we're going. Okay, so the regional IWI conferences were held in cities across the U.S., Boston, San Francisco, Little Rock, and Chicago, just to name some of them. Early on, it's fair to say that these meetings felt secure, focused, energized even. Women gathered, debated, and passed resolutions about childcare, employment, education, and reproductive freedom. There was so much real momentum, but by the midsummer, something had shifted. Stop ERA stormed the gates. Phyllis had mobilized her troops, homemakers in pearls, armed with cassette recordings of Schlafly's speeches, claiming feminism was destroying the family and turning women into lesbians. She really said these things. I mean, it sounds wild now, but this was effective back then. Schlafly had launched an all-out culture war. Schlafly and her housewife foot soldiers swarmed the state meetings. They packed the delegate elections. They hijacked the microphones even. The pretty foundation of the once civil gatherings was starting to show cracks. Take, for instance, the Washington State Conference for Women, one of the meetings that would lead up to the national conference in Houston, Texas. This was in Ellensburg in July 1977. One of the first real signs of the opposition that the feminists faced, thanks to Schlafly and her grassroots movement, became obvious at this point. What was meant to be a forum for discussing common challenges turned into a battleground. Women who felt societal changes were too rapid clashed with those demanding faster reforms. The Equal Rights Amendment became like a symbolic line in the sand. In one now infamous moment in Illinois, a feminist delegate was slapped across the face, in public, by a Schlafly supporter because she dared to speak in favor of lesbian rights. Schlafly could be heard talking about pornographic materials being presented at these meetings, which of course is absolutely untrue. It was educational materials about lesbians and their rights. And there was also information about reproductive rights. The Stop ERA crowd claimed to be defending decency, but their tactics were that of an advanced bully, brutal and aggressive, unable to empathize with the beliefs of others. Phyllis was making herself indisposable to these women. They absolutely were oppressed housewives. Phyllis put a shit ton of work on them and expected them to get it done. She probably looked at them kinder than their husbands and showed them appreciation when they actually completed these things that she put on them, which made them feel special, like a cult often will, all while giving them new language to fuel the fear and hatred of anything different than them. Cult Tactics 101. When the Houston conference finally arrived, Schlafly was banned from speaking. So she did something even more theatrical. She held a counter-conference just down the street, dubbed it the Pro-Family Rally. There's that use of the family again. 20,000 conservatives descended on Houston to shout at the 2,000 inside. They even carried Bibles and signs that read, "Feminists are Satan's whores," and ERA equals homosexual marriage plus abortion. The message was clear. Women could be wives, or they could be the enemy. In many states, these meetings exposed deep divisions. Conservative women, galvanized by Schlafly's rhetoric, attended in mass numbers, aiming to derail feminist agendas. Reports emerged of rigged elections, manipulative parliamentary tactics, and even physical altercations at the conference in Houston. This was a groundbreaking event where feminists gathered to push for ERA ratification. But Schlafly and her army of conservative women staged that counter-protest, the pro-family rally, to drown out the feminist voices, going so far as to take up space in the voting lines just to make the wait longer. With backing from religious groups such as the Catholics, Baptists, and the Mormons, she painted the conference as an attack on Christian values, a phrase that would become a mainstay of right-wing rhetoric in the years to come. Because many of these groups, which are religious or nationalistic, are against federal meddling, social engineering, and efforts to bring about unwanted social change, It meant people who objected to federal activity also rallied. That included groups from the John Birch Society all the way up to the KKK. People who are more comfortable with the way things used to be, and how dare anyone want to advance anything? That's against God. Inside the official conference, though, progress did happen. 36 resolutions passed. The ERA, reproductive freedom, racial justice, workplace equality, they all made it into the final document. Even lesbian rights. A bold, radical move for the time. It should have been the start of something bigger, but instead it became a turning point. Because for every resolution passed in Houston, Schlafly's machine passed fear to millions more. And those pamphlets, those goddamn Schlafly Report pamphlets from her beloved Eagle Forum. But the true cost of Schlafly's war against the ERA wasn't the amendment's upcoming failure, it's the transformation of the conservative movement itself. In rallying evangelicals, Catholics, and right-wing politicians under the guise of family values, Schlafly built the framework of the Reagan-era moral crusade. She linked feminism to abortion, convincing her followers that to be against the ERA was to be against Roe v. Wade. Schlafly's relentless activism turned abortion from a niche religious concern into the central issue of the Republican Party, laying the groundwork for decades of assaults on reproductive rights. More sinister, however, was how she weaponized rape to serve her cause. Schlafly warned that the ERA would eliminate laws that required men to provide for their wives, leading to widespread economic abandonment and even increased sexual violence against women. Of course, this was a flat-out lie. In 1978, she publicly claimed that rape crisis centers, designed to support victims, were actually encouraging false accusations against men, a talking point that eerily foreshadowed today's men's rights, the MRAers, backlash against the #MeToo movement. After allegedly being called out for her lies surrounding cases that she kind of seemed to pull out of thin air when debating, and probably a little tired of being clowned on for her non-lawyer status, she apparently enrolled in school on her spare time, and in 1978 she received that law degree for the sole purpose of boosting her credibility, though it's not like she was credible after that or anything. The audacity of this woman. She threw a party March 23rd, 1979, which was the original ratification deadline, to celebrate the failure of the movement of the ERA, though it would receive a 3-year extension. Phyllis's influence didn't end with the ERA's defeat in 1982, and in just 3 years, her influence would reach all the way to the Oval Office. Schlafly's alliance with the religious right would lead to the Reagan administration's aggressive anti-abortion policies. This would include the Mexico City policy, also known as the Global Gag Rule in 1984, which blocked U.S. funding to foreign organizations that even mentioned the word abortion. She pretty much successfully pushed for abstinence-only education in schools, and was a key player in framing feminists as radical man-haters, which, of course, is a tired old narrative that we still hear to this day, as you know. Phyllis inserted herself directly into the conservative power machine, and not just as a symbolic token of traditional womanhood, no. To use the very conspiratorial language of her book, A Choice, Not an Echo, a kingmaker. Ronald Reagan's administration loved her. she'd helped deliver the Christian right in droves. Upon Reagan's presidency, Phyllis claimed that this was a win for women everywhere. The same Phyllis who warned women they'd be drafted and forced into unisex bathrooms if the ERA passed, was now advising on policy, rallying the troops, and getting comfy with the far-right fringe that was quickly becoming the center of the GOP. She helped stack the Republican platform in 1980 with anti-ERA and anti-abortion language that still lives in their official platform today. She backed Reagan's family values narrative, a coded campaign of white Christian nationalism masked as motherhood. Yet another con used to control. Her playbook helped inspire the moral majority, a political arm of evangelical conservatives that emerged like mildew in the basement of the 1980s. She was also part of the push that convinced Reagan to adopt the Hyde Amendment. This 1978 amendment, which removed federal funding from abortions and drove a wedge between class and access, was the first real win that the conservatives saw after Roe v. Wade. Clinton would later change the rules to include SA and incest, and Biden, once a supporter of the Hyde Amendment, reversed his stance in 2019 when running for president. Anyway, Phyllis spent the Reagan years expanding her empire. She created Eagle Forum University, a learn-at-home activism center that coached generations of conservative women and men in how to fight feminism, abortion, and the homosexual agenda. Sound familiar? It should. This is the movement that raised the Marjorie Taylor Greenes, the Moms for Liberty, the cheerleaders of post-Roe America. You yourself can become an Eagle Forum member right now for just $25 a month. Yeah, she's still banking. At least her family is, anyway. Let's be clear, Schlafly was no political clown. She is the architect of the shit show of what we see happening with reproductive rights in America in the last years. I think her greatest grift was using the housewife persona to build an empire of anti-feminist ideology that helped launch the alt-right into the mainstream. After Reagan, she just kept fueling the movement, adapting her language to new battles like a true cult leader. In the 1990s and 2000s, she went after LGBTQ+ rights, even though her very own son is gay. That's right. While Phyllis was out there crusading against the Equal Rights Amendment, LGBTQ+ rights, and anything that smelled like liberation at all, her own son, John Schlafly, was out there being gay. Outed in the 1990s by Out Week magazine. What a magazine, right? His sexuality became public against his will. But instead of taking a breath and maybe reflecting on these moral stances she has, God forbid, seeing her son as his own person, Phyllis, classic narcissist move, brushed it all off as a personal attack on her. They're just trying to discredit me, she said. Like the gayness wasn't even about him. In a 1992 interview, she stated, "You can say in some sense, I chose to write with my right or left hand. But the point is that it's a decision. That's how I see homosexuality." This comparison suggests that she viewed sexual orientation as a behavior that could be controlled or changed. She also slammed immigrants and continued to blast radical feminists from her Eagle Forum perch. She warned against activist judges, which I'd never heard until I heard Trump say it the other day. And she also warned of liberal universities. She saw every step forward as a threat to the God-ordained patriarchy she was selling like Tupperware. Phyllis Schlafly's legacy profoundly influenced the trajectory of American conservatism, culminating in the rise of figures like Donald Trump to whom Schlafly gave her final endorsement before her death in 2016. Both have employed rhetoric that championed traditional values, often at the expense of marginalized groups. Schlafly's staunch opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment and her anti-immigration sentiments laid the groundwork for Trump's policies and disclosure. For instance, Schlafly's 2015 remarks expressing preference for European immigrants over those from Latin America echo in Trump's stringent immigration policies and rhetoric. Phyllis saw in Trump the culmination of everything she fought for, a man who promised to overturn Roe v. Wade, who openly put women down, and who thrived on division. In her last book, The Conservative Case for Trump, she wrote, quote, "He is the only hope to defeat the kingmakers," end quote. There's that term again that she used for the establishment elites that she so despised. And now, here we are. This ideological lineage has tangible consequences today. The recent case of Selena Maria Chandler Scott in Georgia underscores the perilous state of reproductive rights. Chandler Scott faced criminal charges following a miscarriage, highlighting the intensified scrutiny and legal challenges women encounter in post-Roe America. It does appear as though the charges have been dropped, an update that I just received a few hours ago. Since the overturn of Roe v. Wade, women like Serena are being treated like second-rate citizens, criminals, and sometimes even dying because hospitals won't treat miscarriages unless fetal cardiac activity is at 0, which will be a death sentence for many women. And this is pretty much solely thanks to Phyllis Schlafly, the ultimate pick-me of her time. She was called an Aunt Tom by feminist Betty Friedan, who wrote The Feminine Mystique. So let's take a review. The fall of the ERA made clear the extent of the lost protections for women. There was the birth of a new, aggressive conservatism happening here, one that thrives on controlling bodies and rewriting the narrative of equality. Schlafly won her battle against the ERA, but in doing so, she turned conservatism into something far more dangerous than it was. A movement willing to sacrifice women's autonomy to mainstream power, using wilder and more bonkers rhetoric to keep people in. People who they manipulate using fear of the unknown, fear of the different, fear of anything that makes a person even the slightest bit uncomfortable. As we watch states criminalize miscarriage management and reproductive health care, the United States are living in the wreckage of Schlafly's victory, a dystopian type of reality where, to be honest, is kind of beginning to really resemble The Handmaid's Tale, at least in the beginning. Schlafly never explicitly championed fetal personhood, but her rhetoric fueled the movement that did, which, in my opinion, is why women are dying after being denied basic reproductive health care. By equating feminism with moral decay, she helped lay the groundwork for the religious rights crusade against abortion. In 2002, Phyllis told the Washington Post that, quote, Roe v. Wade was the worst decision in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court and is responsible for killing the millions of unborn babies, end quote. Her fear-based messaging about family values, the sanctity of motherhood, and the supposed evils of feminism directly shaped the anti-choice arguments that led to the overturning of Roe. Her last major act of political grifting was endorsing Donald Trump, despite his well-documented history of all of the horrible things he'd done. Why? Because she knew he would carry out her agenda. And he is, often mirroring her exact style of debating, though he lacks her eloquence. In post Roe v. Wade. We are still unraveling the damage Schlafly inflicted. But there is hope. In the final days of his administration, President Joe Biden made a significant declaration regarding the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, on January 17, 2025. He stated that the ERA should be considered the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, asserting that, quote, the 28th Amendment is now the law of the land, guaranteeing all Americans equal rights and protections under the law regardless of their sex, end quote. However, this proclamation's legal impact remains uncertain. Process of constitutional amendments do not involve the President, and the National Archives has indicated that the ERA cannot be certified due to missed deadlines and unresolved legal questions, even though deadlines are kind of a made-up construct used to delay. There are a few amendments that have gone over 100 years. So there's also the argument that 3 states have rescinded, but that's also something that has never been allowed before. Why now? Why for this? Despite these challenges, the movement to enshrine gender equality continues to gain momentum. Again, advocates are urging Congress to pass resolutions recognizing the ERA's validity and removing previous ratification deadlines. State-level ERAs also play a crucial role in protecting rights. For instance, Nevada's adoption of an inclusive ERA has strengthened legal arguments against restrictions on reproductive rights. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand and other leaders are pushing to enshrine the ERA as the 28th Amendment. While state-level ERAs are gaining traction, and attorneys are actively suing now for equal rights violations in multiple cases, the path forward isn't an easy one. But Schlafly's grip on America isn't unbreakable. The best way to dismantle her legacy is to finish the fight she tried to kill. Demand equality. Push the ERA back into relevancy, because the only way to undo decades of oppression is to force justice through the very system she manipulated to hold us down. And you may be asking, well, what can I do? Well, if you'd like to donate to Selena Maria Chandler Scott, the woman from the beginning of my story who was jailed and accused of trying to cover up her miscarriage in Tifton, Georgia, I have left her information in the show notes, as I said before. To support the ERA's incorporation into the Constitution and safeguard reproductive rights, one can engage with advocacy groups. Organizations like the Feminist Majority Foundation offer resources and avenues to support ERA-related initiatives. Something else you can do, yes, you guessed right, contact your representatives. Express support for the ERA to state and federal legislators, emphasizing constituent backing for gender equality measures. I know it feels a little bit pointless right now with everything happening, but it is something that you can do. And as hard as it is to stay up on all the news coming in right now, it's important to try to stay engaged and monitor developments related to the ERA and reproductive rights to ensure timely and informed advocacy. Now, far be it from me to give you all one more thing to do in your day, but active participation in these efforts, it means a lot, and it contributes to this important movement which is striving for a more equitable and just society. So what did you guys think about Ms. Phyllis Schlafly? I think it's clear she is one of the leading causes of what is happening in America right now, the Trumpism, or what used to kind of be paleoconservatism. What are your thoughts? Leave them in the comments below, and make sure to like, follow, and rate the whole 9 yards, Just remember, stay vigilant, stay vocal. because silence is complicity. See you next time. In the sack. Bye.